Welcome to the Outer Realm with Michelle DeRoche and Amelia Pisano. Airing live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 FM in New Orleans.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Outer Realm Wednesday night segment. We are broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network, UFO Paranormal Radio Network, 105.3 FM from the Gulf Coast, 107.7 FM from New Orleans. We are fully sponsored by the amazing people over at Folgers Coffee who have been with us since day one, and that's 400 plus episodes now. So we're really grateful to you, Folgers. Thank you so very much. Also, big thank you to Dr. Snick, the sonic surgeon, aka Justin Snicker, for his contribution of his time, his voice, and his music for the intro that you just heard. He is an award-winning composer of Halloween, horror, sci-fi, and dark wave electronic music, which can be found on all of your favorite music platforms. Also, big thank you to Steve McGinnis, the artist behind our banners and logos here at the show. Check him out on Facebook and Instagram. Does a lot of great commission pieces and, of course, specializes in the horror genre as well. So tonight, you'll see Amelia's not with us. Let's send her some good vibes. She's under the weather. 'Tis the season, of course. So, big boo, but I know she'll be listening in. So, like I said, let's send her some really good vibes and get her all healed up and back on track. So tonight, I'm really excited about tonight's show. Michael Flem, amazing author, amazing researcher. He's written a book called Visions of Atlantis, Reclaiming Our Lost Ancient Legacy. And let's face it, isn't Atlantis like one of the world's like biggest mysteries? I mean, everybody has done movies about it. Everybody's talked about it, written about it, and we're not really any further ahead. So, but I love it. And he's got a fantastic amount of research going on. I could not get my face out of this book, and I really didn't know what to expect at first. I thought, okay, because I just have read so much stuff on it and researched it, pretty extensively myself. And I have to say, I don't think I've read a book that has been so well researched. And you throw in some of the metaphysical stuff. As a big Edgar Cayce fan, I just really would have loved to have met this man in person. Just as the information that he could channel was phenomenal. But I do also know, being in this field for 20 plus years, that sometimes your answers do come from otherworldly sources. And it's happened to me a multitude of times on different levels. So this book has something for everyone, but it was really refreshing to read something written and researched by someone who really seems to get it. So with that being said, it's going to be a great show. Tune in. And remember, guys, we are, 7 chat rooms, superhighway coming down one lane. We'll try to, get to you, but we have to keep up with the guests. That's the big important thing here. So patience. Anyway, if I flash your comments across, it's just for the viewers to see. And we have loads and loads of audio listeners. I mean, there's millions of you guys out there. So if you want to jump into chat, you come on in and view and get your comments in there as well. So without further ado, our special guest tonight, Michael. Hello.
Hey, how are you, Michelle?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good.
Good. I'm going to put up the book here. Bam. There it is, guys. This is what I've been going on about. So
there it is.
Kudos. I have to say kudos. What a book. What a book.
Thank you. And thank you for the kind intro. That's so nice. When you start writing a book like this, um, you never know really where it's going to take you. And you, of course, never know how it's going to be received, what your colleagues in the history world will think of you. But I did
Oh.
it nevertheless. And yeah, and to my great surprise, it's been really well received, and I was so skeptical since I self-published it and
Mm,
designed the cover myself and edited it myself. If it would be taken seriously. But to my great surprise, yeah, it actually went to #1 bestseller in prehistory in last summer. So I was really
wow.
surprised, and um, I can't really take full credit for it. I think in many ways this book was kind of using me to write it in a weird way, and I really feel that way. And
Right.
so I think what I was trying to do was look at the purely historical data, archaeological data, oceanographic, geological,
Right.
and at the same time give a voice to the more clairvoyant and esoteric information and see really where the two overlap,
Hmm.
um, and explain to people who might not be familiar or comfortable with such data that not only does our government and other governments use and have been using remote viewing to great success under wraps for
Hmm.
decades, but that it's a real process. It's not something that's even really necessarily mystical. It's just a kind of attunement with a super conscious field that certain people are more able to do than others.
Hmm.
Um, and, as you mentioned, Edgar Casey, I picked him because he was one of the most well documented and
Hmm.
studied clairvoyants. He wasn't just a person on um, Reddit who said, "Hey, I had a past life in Atlantis." He actually, you
Right.
know, gave 15,000 trance readings and
Right.
was studied by professionals, medical professionals from Harvard, Stanford,
Right.
Princeton, who used him to actually heal people.
Right.
And so when he started talking about Atlantis kind of halfway through his career, it really caught my attention. And then when I actually juxtaposed what he was saying in the 1930s, almost 100 years ago,
Mm.
against what modern archaeology has now been discovering, which he could not have known, it was quite astounding how much
Right.
of what he said about this time period actually lined up. So,
I agree with you. I mean, he wrote a book himself on Atlantis, didn't he? Like he it was quite an interest for him, and he just seemed to have channeled with people,
mm,
or should I say, he did readings with people, and it started to surface, and I think that started piquing his interest a little bit as well. I love that you blended it in there because it does, give that extra credence to the field,
mm,
so to speak, as well, and get you maybe a few of those answers that maybe you wouldn't have gotten without it.
exactly. And that's exactly what I was trying to do, Michelle, was I was thinking, okay, look, if Plato and,
Mhm.
certain pre-Platonic sources or, you know, post-Platonic sources
Right.
say kind of paint a kind of like at the eye exam, it's like, is this clear? Is this blurry? It's like, well, you can see it, but we don't really know.
Right.
So to get that 2020 vision um, of such a remote time period, you're talking 12,000 years to the destruction and then whatever preceded that,
Right.
you actually have to go into the clairvoyant evidence
Yes.
because as detailed as Plato's account, which was written in 360 BC, in his two dialogues was, it talks about some of the plants and the circular city and the empire and how warfare was waged and the kings and this and that. But it doesn't exactly give you a precise image of like, well, what was daily life like at certain times in this
Right.
civilization? And it's really astounding the level of detail that Edgar Casey gave about arcane power sources,
Hmm.
about the science of Atlantis, the spirituality of Atlantis, how they viewed cosmology, how they
Hmm.
viewed the role of the sun
Hmm.
as the kind of creative, intelligent, generative source of life.
Hmm.
How that later carried on into Egyptian beliefs of the sun. Because Casey
Absolutely.
himself was one of the first to, believe it or not, link Giza to Atlantis as a vestige of the civilization, kind of
Yeah.
reboot after the
Right.
cataclysm. And of course, that work has been adapted by a lot of people, Graham Hancock and other, Robert Bauval, Robert Schoch.
Hmm.
But Casey has almost a movie script subplot in those 500 readings of what the Egyptian kind
Hmm.
of Atlantis part two was,
Hmm.
and the struggles that that culture went with, and how the Great Pyramid, in Casey's estimation, was actually built in the
Hmm.
year 10,390, not in dynastic Egypt as a tomb for Khufu and all this nonsense that we
No, I agree with you. I've been,
superimposed.
yeah, I've
Mm,
been to the pyramids, and everything about them is very intuitive. Just screams much older. You're just
mm,
much older. You could just see, it's an experience and a half, but it's just not what it claims to be, unfortunately. Which I
mm.
think it's wonderful when you think about how far back it goes. The thing that intrigued me here is you make reference to the fact that Atlantis could have been like a million-year-old, culture.
Well, I just say what I can safely say with evidence. Nothing in this book is really, my opinion. My opinion only comes in if, it's with what sources to include and which sources to focus on.
Right.
Um, and regarding the beginnings of Atlantis, that's a kind of really important thing. And I think I'll kind of try to break it down.
Please do.
I
Right.
always try to break it down, and I'll say, "Oh, I'll keep it short," and then it's like an hour and 45 minutes later. Um,
No, the stage
but
is
it's
yours.
come to my attention, especially lately. And again, I mean no disrespect for people that are looking like for this kind of thing, but
Right.
this obsession with oh, we found a circular city in Mauritania. We found the Rishat structure, and necessarily we found Atlantis. And I say, okay, well, let's step back, let's calm down,
Yeah.
let's read what Plato said. And of course, you'll find in his dialogues that, yes, there was a circular capital city in one of multiple principal islands, which
Right.
were where the current Azores are today, not Mauritania, which themselves had colonial dominion over
Hmm.
the entire Mediterranean, starting from Gibraltar to Egypt.
Hmm.
That's what Plato said. And from which you could reach the whole of the other continent beyond the true sea. So, North America.
North America.
So, let's just start with that. That's
Okay.
odd that a Greek philosopher in 360 BC, recounting a story that his distant relative 200 years earlier was told by Egyptians in the Temple of Sais, who in 560 BC were aware of North America, apparently. Um, the other thing that's quite interesting is the date he gives. And so when Solon, who was a real person vetted
Hmm.
by historical sources, he was an Athenian law reformer.
Hmm.
He went to Egypt and he said, "Look, we don't have records that go back as far as the Egyptians." And they said, "Of course you don't. You're silly Greeks. We write everything down on stone. You just, write them down on papyrus. So, of course, you're here.
Hmm.
What would you like to know?" And he said, "I'd like to know the history of my culture." And so they said, "Well, there was a time when your culture defended all of the Mediterranean against this marauding group of Atlanteans who entered the Straits of Gibraltar and, put all of the Mediterranean at extremity until Athena and her people defeated them in a kind of pre-Doric, Greek society." And Solon says, "Okay, when was that?" He says 9,000 years before this time. So you can put roughly 9,600 BC for that encounter. And he
Right.
said, but after that battle in the Mediterranean, the island of Atlantis was subsumed under a great, was swallowed up by the sea, and tremendous earthquakes racked the earth, and all was lost. Now, that's an interesting date if this is what most people call a, fable, which, by the way, Plato begins the dialogue by disclaiming, Socrates, this is a strange story, but every word of it is true. It's vouched for by Solon, the wisest of the seven sages. So he tells you it's not a myth, it's not a fable, it's a factual account. But if you look at that date, 9,600 BC, well, what is that? That's within plus or minus 100 years of the official mainstream end of the Ice Age by cataclysm. So how did the ancient Egyptians, if this is a fictional story, know when the Holocene era began without ice core samples and bathythermic scans and satellite image radar?
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
And then they attributed it to what Solon was told. He said, well, what happened? And they said, well, you Greeks have this myth of Phaeton, who is a naughty child who's driving his father's chariot across the sky, and he loses control and he burns everything up upon the earth. And he says, you've mythologized that, but it really signifies the actual declination of heavenly bodies that occasionally fall to earth and burn everything up upon it. So they identified a catastrophic, cataclysmic comet or comet fragment, many people believe, from the toroid asteroid belt, stream of comet fragments hitting the earth at 9,600 roughly BC. And that's exactly what modern science has come to the conclusion, that something happened in 9,600 plus or minus 100 year BC, which ended the Younger Dryas period.
Right.
And that's exactly what an uneducated 6th grade education psychic from Hopkinsville, Kentucky said in his own readings, having no knowledge outside of his trance of any of this.
Right.
That's also the exact time that the Indian Vedas mention a cataclysmic impact on Earth.
Right.
With this story of, I think it's Vrinka, as the name for the comet. And it's like, if all of this is fake, then the data wouldn't line up. So right off the bat, when people say, well, that couldn't happen. Well, the actual historical record, the psychic record, and the archaeological, geological, climatological record actually supports that exact date, plus or minus 100 years, for the destruction of whatever existed.
Right.
And so that's the starting point, just to get that.
Just to start. I love it. I love it. We're just to start. It's exciting. Please continue.
Just to get that out of the way.
Right.
And in Casey's estimation, it's quite interesting because in mainstream science, you have this idea that, that last period, the Younger Dryas, which was roughly, I believe, 12 to 1,300 years of an extreme cooling period, when the Ice Age had actually been in a warming trend, and then it suddenly plunged into a freezing period. And what's interesting is that that's almost exactly in the 1,200 plus or minus 100-year window in the Vedic Yuga system for a destruction by water by celestial bodies called cataclysmos.
Right.
And again, it's like, that's almost like the Yugic cycle actually is the duration of the Younger Dryas period, the Yuga gap between the two Yugas, actually transitioning from one Yuga to another Yuga. That gap is, and many people believe that multiple comet fragments, came in, that as the Earth was passing through the toroid asteroid belt, multiple fragments were coming in. Maybe one came in at 10,000, one came in at 9,800, another one, and then the big one finished everything off, it appears, at 9,600 BC. And that actually makes sense because in Edgar Casey's estimation, he gives very precise dates for the first two destructions of Atlantis. One being 50,722 BC.
Wow.
When it was a continent that basically stretched where the exact location of the mid-Atlantic ridge is today, which is still the biggest mountain range in the world.
Wow.
It's underwater. But 22 or 50,000 years ago would have been about 700 feet lower in sea level.
Right.
So that would have been above ground.
Right.
Plus, the continental shelf of the United States would have been above ground out to about 20 kilometers.
Right.
He says that as well. He says the shelf of the North American eastern seaboard were the lowlands of Atlantis, which at that point was a continental landmass. And so the first destruction, which I'll leave that cliffhanger, that's a very interesting technological, ecological, but technologically caused mishap to multiple Atlantean factions trying to affect the Earth's climate. And he says the second one, which at that point started at 28,000 BC, when Atlantis had broken into 5 huge subcontinental islands, also was human caused by a misapplication of this tremendously powerful technology called the Firestone, which was this 6-sided crystal that could harness kind of celestial energy and store it in the ground. And because of a mistuning by an engineer who actually was a person who came for a past life reading. And he said, who was I in a past life, Mr. Casey? He said, you really want to know? You were the guy that uptuned the Firestone crystal and overloaded the substations on the main primary island, and you destroyed Atlantis the second time. And he said, when was that? 28,000 BC.
Wow.
And the final destruction, by that point, Atlantis had been reduced to 3 small islands, but still large, still about the size of England.
Right.
Off what I would consider where the Azores Basin is today, what's called Dolphin Ridge.
Yes.
And that doesn't have an actual, human-caused end. It has a natural end, which is this asteroid fragment debacle that overtook the Earth. And it makes perfect sense because in Plato's account, he's getting the story of the final destruction.
Right.
He doesn't mention the first 2. And so it was so important to me, these clairvoyant sources, because it's such a common critique that, well, where the hell are you getting this, like crystals and lasers and flying machines and all of this stuff? That's not in the dialogues of Plato, and it's not.
Right.
But in a second channeled source that I found, which is even more bizarre and could not have been influenced really by anything. It's the first channeled source in the world, to my knowledge, to mention Atlantis. From 1881, which is A Dweller on Two Planets by Frederick Oliver, who is a 17-year-old kid, uneducated, living in the California frontier near Mount Shasta, who starts hearing voices in his head through clairaudience. Yes, I understand. You can start laughing, as I did when I first started reading this book. And then proceeds to write a 400-page, basically Shakespearean drama at the level beyond any graduate student I've ever advised.
Right.
On the history of Atlantis, starting from 11,116 BC. Or excuse me, 60 BC. Again, a very interesting date for a kid of 17 years old, writing in 1881, when 50 years earlier, electricity had been introduced to the continent. And in his description, he actually explains that transition. He said, when Atlantis had reached about 11,000 BC, it was at its apex of technology. It had cigar-shaped aluminum flying craft that were transmedium, that didn't have flight surfaces, similar to many UFO reports.
Yes.
It had monorail transit across the whole principal island, which he called Poseid at that time. He said there were 3 islands. One of them was called Poseid. And that's very interesting because in Plato's account of Atlantis, what's in the center of the capital city? It's a statue of Poseidon.
That's right.
Ares surrounding it.
Right.
So to my argument that Plato was actually talking about the island of Poseid, the final iteration of the Atlantean culture, much like we have the British Empire in 1775.
Mm. Right.
And it's like you've got an outpost in Southeast Asia, you've got India, you've got West Africa, you've got the Bahamas, you've got the Mosquito Coast, you've got North American colonies, you've got London.
Yes.
And it's like if we were looking for the British Empire and you just found
It's everywhere.
New York, it's like,
yeah.
Well, is that the British Empire? No,
right.
Neither is London.
Right.
The island of England is the nucleus of a transatlantic empire. And that's exactly what Plato said. You know, so when people look for this, I need to find the circular city. It's like, well, maybe you don't need to find the circular city. Maybe you just need to find commonalities on both shores of the Atlantic. And if you're lucky, that would be awesome, of course, to, you know, look below the Azores and find evidence of Poseid.
It's there. It's there. Yeah, I think people just need to open their minds to the fact that it's not what we've been conditioned to believe. No, it's not necessarily off the island of Santorini, to which I've been. I've checked it out. You know, you know,
I love that argument, by the way.
Oh, isn't it?
I actually, one of the first critics of the book,
yes.
It was hilarious because it's the only negative attack I've gotten of hundreds of positive reviews and everything. And it was a man who had written a book basically on that argument that Atlantis is in the Mediterranean. And it's so almost comically silly to suggest that, because no one, you can read every translation of ancient Greek into English, read 5 different translations, but you know, I just use the standard one by classics professor Benjamin Jowett, who definitely knew what he was doing when he translated words. And there's no way to equate the Straits of Gibraltar or the Pillars of Hercules or the Pillars of Heracles with the straits between Sicily and Libya or the island of Crete and the mainland. It's like Plato distinctly says they entered from the Pillars of Hercules, which is a inland sea, as opposed to the outer sea, which the island resided in. And it's like, you just don't like that, because then you have to actually think for yourself and go, oh, actually, perhaps everything I've thought about ancient history starting in Sumeria in the Fertile Crescent is actually just a reboot of a much older civilization. And
I agree.
I don't like that. So I'm going to take the, you know, super volcano that went off in Crete, which has absolutely nothing to do with Atlantis, and say, well, that's just what Plato meant. And it's like, okay, well, where did he get 9600 BC? Why was an Egyptian telling him that story? Where the hell did the pyramids come from? Why are they aligned to 10,000?
There's no pyramids on Santorini. I'm just saying.
No pyramids on Santorini.
No, there's the ancient city there was very interesting. I went down into the volcano. I thought that was interesting. Just trying to get a feel, you know, for what people we're talking about. And I'm saying, this looks so small. It just doesn't make any sense. But as far as coming up along, you know, the coast, there was a continent there at one time that's completely underwater, much like, you know, Mu and ancient Lemuria. So I try to put that in the back of my mind. So, okay, well, there's a continent. It's gone. Maybe, you know. Then we get into the Bimini Wall, you know, which is on the other side, of the Atlantic.
I've been to Bimini, grew up in South Florida.
There you go, right? And you know, they were starting to be a bit compelling when the eye of the Sahara. They were really at least getting warmer. You just have to go a little bit further.
Yeah. Well, and again, I always say I talk about the eye of the Sahara in my book, and I say, look, you know, it doesn't like I don't have any like personal stake in it. Has to be
right.
I just look at the eye of the Sahara, and you know, I'm not the only one that thinks this. It's like they've identified eyes of Sahara on other planets, you know, which again, you could say, well, maybe, you know, eventually there was a civilization on Mars, and you know, that's actually not. I mean, the CIA did a remote viewing on Mars 1 million BC, and they discovered that actually was probably true. But I think it's kind of not really where Plato was saying it was. And to my knowledge, even though that was a fertile region 10,000 years ago, with an advanced, vast river system, actually, that they discovered in the 80s, that Edgar Casey said existed in 1932 before anybody knew.
Right.
It doesn't, to me, fit the bill for the principal city of a island, which Plato clearly described in its size would have been, a certain size.
Right.
But it does bear a striking resemblance to the dimensions of the canals and the walls and the inlet that comes out of it. I understand that,
That's
but it could also
interesting.
be a repeat. Like there are more than one city that look like New York.
Absolutely.
You can find London. It doesn't mean you found Paris. It's like, okay, if that was a city that worked, I'm sure they had multiple circular cities. I'm sure that was just like there are multiple pyramids in China and Mexico and
yes,
Egypt that look similar. Doesn't
Yes.
mean they're from the exact same culture.
Exactly.
But I think the bigger problem I have with the circular city is when people think, because they don't read the damn dialogue, that the whole culture just existed in this circular city, and then there was like a foot of beach, and that was it. And when we find that, we'll find Atlantis. And it's like, no.
But where's a pyramid?
Yeah.
It's
like, no, it was a very large island called Poseid, which was one of multiple in an archipelago, probably where the Azores Basin is today.
Yes.
That had colonies all through the Mediterranean. So naturally, you're going to find, and actually Edgar Casey said, one of the places you can find evidence of Atlantis is in Morocco, which in the time he was saying that actually was, I think, lower in its boundaries, which could have been interpreted as northern Mauritania, where the Eye of the Sahara is. So I have a lot of, respect for people, but it doesn't mean that that's where the principal island was. And I think it's silly to just look for the city when you're looking for evidence of a global, basically, culture.
Right. But I love that they're actually investigating it now in the Azores. Like they're really feeling like they're onto something. But how much of our ancient culture lays beneath the waves? And Atlantis, I like that you touched on that. I like that you put it out there. It's like, no, this was, like you say, there was a kingdom, but you had places everywhere. There's just too many similarities. Literally, I mean, South America is like, come on. Like that, there's so much there, so much.
No, it's incredible. And actually, I always tell people, think of it in reverse. Like, okay, does it make more sense that there was a mid-Atlantic nucleus empire or not when you find language similarities in Yucatan, Mexico, with the Pyrenees Mountains on the border of Spain and France?
Right.
And then when a psychic man who has no education or knowledge of this in waking life says, oh, by the way, when they knew the civilization was going to be destroyed because of astrological signs and their own divination process, they went to the Pyrenees and the Yucatan Peninsula. And it's like, he didn't say Greenland and Germany.
Right.
And so when I contacted like the Center for Basque Studies, where the Basque language, which is not an Indo-European language,
no, it's right,
just pops up out of nowhere. They even say on their website, some people even think the Basques are the descendants of Atlantis. And it's like, yeah, some people do, because it doesn't make any goddamn sense, excuse my language, if that didn't exist. And you take a person from Yucatan who speaks Yucatec, and you take them to, the north of Spain on the French border, and they can understand on a base level some of each other's, words. And it makes no sense. And at the same time, the names Edgar Casey gave for people in their past life iterations in Atlantis are unbelievably similar to Basque and Yucatec names.
Right.
And you couldn't just make this up.
No. There's no way.
Some of the names are so bizarre. It's like, Michelle, you were this in Roman times. Your name was Lucretia. You were an attendant of Julius Caesar. And then in the third destruction of Atlantis, your name was Itor. Aitor. And his stenographer's sitting there like, how do you spell that? In her notes, like, how do you Aitor? So I took every name that Casey gave for the past life readings. It took me months.
Right.
I went through all the archives and I itemized them alphabetically.
Right.
Like Aitor, Onxor, Ilax, Ishtar, Ilman, Minar, Mintor. And then I took a list of common Basque names. And it's like, they're almost exact, you know? And I don't think Edgar Casey had a Basque dictionary next to him when he was given these lessons.
So,
you know,
is that, all this to do about this mysterious Rh negative blood, which the Basque region, of course, and the Basque people are probably the highest concentration in the world. Do you think maybe that was where Atlantean?
Well, it's strange, and there appears to be some kind of weird connection with Rh negative blood and, ancient Cro-Magnon populations. Like even in the, Tuareg culture or the North Africans, Berber people who, are pretty racially diverse, but they also have a very strange proportion. And again, that's where Casey said there was a large Atlantean colony.
Yes.
And what else is interesting is that there used to be a road that actually is still, like, traces of it still exist, that went basically all the way across North Africa and ends in Abydos, Egypt. And many people think that, these survivors didn't just take boats. Like, a lot of them just got to North Africa and walked on this pilgrimage until they got to Egypt to reboot the society, which 12,000 years ago was a fertile grassland. It was not a desert.
Correct.
And what's interesting is that around one part of Algeria, I think in Tassili near the caves, there's strange rock art that comes from exactly that time period of the cataclysm. And it's like, who made that?
Right.
It's just, it actually, and Herodotus actually walked that road. He wanted to see for himself. He went to Egypt and he said, the Egyptians said that at one point in their ancient history, they migrated from some far place in the West in the before time on this road. I'm going to go see if this is real. And he walked the road and he's like, it is real.
Right.
So it's kind of,
it's all there if you know what you're looking for, right?
That's right.
Hidden in plain
and
sight.
If you know what to use and what to screen against. I was very averse to using too many modern channelers because I had anticipated, I'm always my harshest critic, I had anticipated people saying, well, this person could have just watched movies or read other Edgar Casey books. And it's true, there's no way to know.
Right.
So I wanted to see, okay, what was the first one or two instances where Atlantis was pushed to that date, mixed with high technology, and the people saying that could have had no knowledge, and they were vetted by friends, doctors, scientists that studied them and had proven other things unrelated to Atlantis, like, I don't know, 8,000 medical diagnoses that had 98% accuracy in Edgar Casey's case that saved people's lives. That's a credible source.
Right. That is pretty credible.
It's pretty credible.
I think Edgar Casey more than proved himself, even in, to academics of his time. I think anything that he said could have been taken with great credibility. And the fact that you were able to cross-reference so many different things, to me, is even more credibility and validation. So it's hard because modern day academia sort of says, no, that's ridiculous. But you can't, when you can cross-reference it to something that's already there and approved by them, like that they've already explored, then how do you discount that?
It's true. And I always tell people, that I was recently reading an excellent book on the Yuga cycles that just came out by Dev Mishra, incredible researcher. And I cited him in my book, but he had published this after my book came out. And I was just reading it last night. And, he reminds people all the time that until Charles Darwin, it was never assumed that history progressed linearly. That's not how people viewed the Renaissance view of history. It was only in the 19th century, really, when people started to believe, because of their powers of colonization and the extreme disparity in technology between, say, Europeans and indigenous people, that we must necessarily be at the apex. And he was aware of ancient historical cyclical trends of history, where civilizations rise, fall, rise, fall. And Mishra puts a very interesting quote where he says, I'm aware of that, but that's not a very cheerful way to look at history. And in light of our tremendous advances as Europeans, we should discount it. And with that simple phrase, he set the tone for the next, 200 years of professional quote unquote history that discounts the possibility that we are not at the teleological edge and apex of a slow progression from nothing to iPhone 10, and that it's impossible that we could have been here before and way beyond and just been utterly destroyed.
So, what did or would he make out of place artifacts? And, I mean, there are mines that are 300 million plus years old that were fully functioning in different, remote countries of the world. Like there are.
I'm thinking of, the dating of, I think it's 56,000 BC. There's a mine of hematite in Swaziland.
Right.
And it's like, well, what are hunter-gatherers doing with an industrial mining operation? The other thing is,
what about that?
What about the, tentative dating of the Gunung Padang Pyramid in, South Pacific, which is dated roughly to 27,000 BC? Were hunter-gatherers building that at the top of a mountain? Like,
exactly.
What about Göbekli Tepe, which is officially, unequivocally dated to the, same period as the end of Atlantis, but we still haven't updated the textbooks.
They just found another one that was even older, not far from there. So So they're saying this is older than Göbekli. It's just like, probably by 1,000 years, nothing major. But the fact remains is that this was happening.
Right.
You can't discount that. Like, you can't.
Or an entire underground city in Cappadocia near Göbekli Tepe that we couldn't build today.
No.
It goes down like 50 stories tunneled into the mountain. It's like, who did that and why?
Yes.
Maybe they had anticipated a coming cosmic catastrophe. I mean, there's no logical reason. It doesn't make sense from a military perspective. You're not safer in an underground city.
No.
But you need to escape the surface destruction. It does make sense. So
water, especially ice.
Right. And it's like, when you start piecing together, because the clairvoyant evidence was probably a third of the book, but really the majority of the book is pretty straight in terms of oceanographic charts, bathythermic scans that show, hey, look, this, and to me, really one of the most like shocking, I even had to call a friend because I'm like, am I going crazy here? Was like 7 years ago, before the book was even like a thing, I was just doing research and I was reading A Dweller on Two Planets, that channeled text from 1881.
Right.
And the kid just casually includes a sketch and he says, this is what Poseid looked like at its peak. He draws a very detailed triangular shaped island. And he says, this is where the capital was. This is where the circular city was. This is where our manufacturing was. And he puts names, and this is where the rivers were. He draws a very precise, jagged outline of the coast.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, let's just see. I didn't even believe in channeling at this time 7 years ago. I was just a history professor at the university.
Yeah, as an academic guy, right? Yeah.
I said, let me just see if I can find this puzzle piece in the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
So I looked off the coast of Portugal and I looked at a map, a satellite image of what's the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean look like with no water. That drawing fits exactly over the landmass under the Azores. And
Wow.
what's shocking is I spent about 6 months looking through every ancient, or not ancient, but 19th century map database.
Right.
Was there a picture anywhere, even if he had to travel to the Vatican,
Right.
from Oregon to find
Yeah.
this map, which, he didn't do?
Right. Right.
Could he have seen that shape and just copied it in this fictional, quote unquote, book that's not fictional? No, because the Mid-Atlantic Ridge was only discovered 5 years before he sketched that. And
Right.
their image that he'd have to go to a Oceanographic Institute in Washington, D.C. to see it. It didn't just appear in the Mount Shasta Public Library in the Wild West. Exactly.
Okay, but in all fairness, Mount Shasta is like Portal Haven.
Well, and it's interesting that he wrote that book in the shadow of Mount Shasta.
Just saying.
It's very interesting that his source says, I'm from there.
See? Yeah.
He lived in Eureka with a Y, Ereka, Eureka,
Right.
Washington. But he said, I lived in the shadow of Mount Shasta.
Right.
But it's weird because their map of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge just has soundings. Like, this is the depth here, this is the depth there. It's shallower here than not. But when you look at a bathythermic satellite scan from 2020, it's exactly to the millimeter what this kid channeled and drew in 1881.
Which is crazy.
And that's Poseidon. And where is it? Exactly where Plato said it was.
In the Azores.
And they found a pyramid in 400 feet of water off the coast of Terceira in the Azores. And I actually contacted that man through a Portuguese translator.
Right.
And he told my translator, I swear to God, I am a professional fisherman. Here's a picture of my depth finder in real time that I took when I was over that pyramid, which was aligned exactly to true north. And you can look on the depth finder. And I said, look, I used to work on a fishing boat. I used to fix the depth finder on the fishing boat. I'm familiar with the technology. And I couldn't believe it. And I included that in the book. He was on national television in Portugal.
It was a huge discovery.
Yeah. And then it just, people claim they couldn't find it again. But he gave me the coordinates. And he said, look, if you ever want, he's quite old now and he's not in good health, but he said, look, if you ever come out here, I'll take you out there.
Yes.
And you see it
you're
for your
allowed
damn self.
to now. Like the Navy, I think it was, just sort of ixnayed everything just to keep people from going there and diving there or doing anything. And it's the Navy that started investigating it, I believe.
Yes.
I mean, come on, right?
Of course.
What are we going to find?
They said conclusively it was a malfunction of his depth finder.
Oh, was it? Oh, sure.
Yeah. So the depth finder malfunctioned, but it produced a perfect cardinally aligned pyramid in the same shape as the Great Pyramid at Giza. Yeah, that's an interesting malfunction. I've never had a depth finder malfunction that way.
Wow.
Personally,
wow.
so.
Because
of course
they found something. They found something in there that they don't want anyone near. There's technology. It's all there. It may be underwater, but it's all there. If you know what you're looking for.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because part of the book is not just trying to show people the actual evidence, but it's to show how did actual academics view this subject until quite recently. And what was really interesting to me was really until like the last, if you think, okay, this story has been around in the West at least since 2,360 years ago when Plato wrote about it.
Right.
So in those 2,360 years, or 84 years now, what was the majority of consensus opinion on it? And you find that really until like 1995, when Graham Hancock started to get popular, almost everyone treated this seriously. And that gave me a tremendous amount of relief that, I don't know, Francis Bacon, like the founder of the scientific method, he was a believer. Michel de Montaigne, the inventor of the literary essay and a
Mhm.
the first person to say that Native Americans in the West Indies had the same souls as the Europeans, like not a small figure. He thought it was real. You
Yes.
know,
Yes.
the
Yes.
official chronicler of the conquest of the Americas,
Mhm.
a man named de Gomara,
Mhm.
he was the first to notice, hey, it's interesting. Some of these natives have words like atl, and that word appears in North Africa and it means water. And he's like, that's interesting because a lot of these Aztecs claim they come from Aztlan as we, murder them and burn their churches and everything.
Sure.
But it's
Yeah.
interesting that they say they're from Aztlan. Maybe that's Atlantis that the great philosopher talked about because they were
Right.
all reading Plato.
Right.
And so it's astoundingly arrogant and hilarious to me when some goofball like Michael Shermer comes along, who has never even set foot seriously into the past, but
Mm.
sits on this kind of, pedestal and, Graham Hancock is a fraud and go to my website and I'll debunk everything for, a price.
It's easy to debunk something if you don't believe it.
It's easy to debunk something if you don't know anything about it.
Well, exactly, and you
Even
clearly you
easier.
don't want to know because all you want to do is disprove it. I think
Right.
if you're going to do any sort of research like that, you have to have some kind of an open mind because
Absolutely.
it makes you look foolish. It's just like you're saying, as you're talking about him sitting there going, it's absolutely foolish. Everybody, people want to know. This has been one of them, like our society, our you know, populace as far as a civilization goes, it's been a big mystery. Where is it? How many shows have you seen on this? How many books have been written? How many conversations have happened? Kids shows, kids books. I mean, on every possible level. Atlantis has always been on the tip of many people's tongues
Yeah.
with theorizing where it actually is.
You're right. And I think probably part of the reason I wrote this was because I was so tired of listening to people tell me what to think. And I said, I'm going to write a book that anybody from, you know, the expert to the absolute beginner can pick up from page 1 to page 396 and actually enjoy a curated story by a professional historian of intellectual history. That's what I study. I study how ideas evolve throughout Western history. And
Right.
nobody had really done that with this. And that was a very important part because it's not enough to just say, look at this ice core sample. Look at this. You've got to see who has treated this subject seriously. And then why has it become this kind of silly thing in recent times
Mm-hmm.
for some people? But,
Right.
you realize that the majority of people actually, when they know you're not, going to judge them, they go, oh, actually, I've always wondered about that. And then there'll be a third person in the bar. What are you talking about, Atlantis? Oh, no, I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about,
Because
something
people
safe.
look at it as that this is just some myth. People look at things like this. I don't understand, how and there's no disrespect. I'm just bending some minds here a little bit. But people don't see the creator. They don't see
Hmm,
source. They don't see God.
that's
Whatever
right.
you call what your belief. You don't see it, but you believe it. So why, if they don't see something like this mythical place, is it because it's been made, we've been conditioned to think this is a myth, it never existed? Um, it's like Journey to the Center of the Earth. Is there anything there in Earth? Don't be silly.
Hmm.
Damn it, I want to know that there's hobbits
Well,
there.
we've never
Like
gone deep enough. So it's like that's
exactly,
more undiscovered than the oceans. So
exactly.
let's
So
not laugh at that either. I mean, there's actually
exactly.
from Dolores Cannon's channelings, there's an entire
Yes.
civilization under the Gulf of Mexico.
Oh yes.
Now, can I prove
Yes.
that? I don't know.
I
But
don't know, but
Hitler
wouldn't it be
believed in it.
fun
The
just to
Nazi, the Nazis were looking for Agartha, and I wouldn't
Yes.
exactly call them silly people.
No, they
But
were looking for everything.
right.
Everything.
So, it's interesting because I think, I always tell people it, what's so frustrating is that so much of the evidence is in plain sight. It's right there. Like we still cannot, and let me repeat this for anyone listening, There is no record that anyone has seen. Perhaps it exists in the Vatican after the Library of Alexandria was pillaged and destroyed.
We know it does.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. But to the rest of us, no record of how the Great Pyramid was constructed in a culture called dynastic Egypt, allegedly, that has the most meticulous and extensive record keeping of any civilization on earth. And yet their astounding, impossible structure, they themselves don't have a record of. Well, does that lend more or less credibility to the claim that they inherited it?
Right.
That it was there a long time before dynastic Egypt appeared, in, let's say, the 4th millennium BC.
Right.
That it actually was there for 6,000 years and was built by the Atlanteans in conjunction with other groups, as Casey says, leading to this mixture of people that created the Egyptian race. That actually makes sense. And then you go, okay, well, what's the date Edgar Casey gives? 10,390 for its completion, and it took 100 years. You go, okay. And then you look at Robert Bauval, who was looking at an aerial map of Cairo in the museum, and he said, it's interesting that those 3 pyramids look like the constellation Orion.
Yes.
I wonder if they line up with it. So he puts it in a computer in the 80s, and he's like, it doesn't fit. But he goes, well, wait a minute. When does it fit? Oh, 10,450 BC. It's like, oh, that's just another crazy, coincidence. It's like, you're a fool if you look at things that are that exact and you say that's a coincidence, because by that logic, well, then let's just throw everything away, because everything's just a coincidence then. Don't tell me anything about the ancient Greeks. Don't tell me anything about dynastic Egypt. Don't tell me anything about ancient Sumeria, because it's all just a coincidence. But suddenly when it's Atlantis, it's, it couldn't be, And I never understood that. Why is it difficult to think that civilization started from allegedly hunter-gatherers to Göbekli Tepe, the pyramids, law, writing, religion, language?
Sumerian civilization is probably, which I think you actually do mention, I do. One of the oldest, if not the oldest, civilization. I mean, it goes back, they dated ancient Sumerian kings back 450,000 years ago.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that, because who's smarter, me and you, or the people that invented civilization? So I always think to myself when people say, yeah, well, they say that the, extraterrestrials came, and, the Apkallu came, and the Anunnaki and Anuna and all this, and Enki and Ea, but they got the date wrong. It wasn't that long ago. What they really meant was that they landed in New York City in 1965, and it's no big deal. It's not a like, It's like when people tell me Plato couldn't have said 9,600 BC because we all know nothing existed then. And it's like, you've already told me just how little you know about, well, what was going on at 9,006. Oh, right. The cataclysm that ended the Ice Age that he guessed. But you want to put it at 960 because that fits dynastic Egyptian times. And therefore it explains how Egypt could have been fighting the Atlanteans in Crete and all this BS. And it's just like, we don't do that to anything else. When the Egyptians in dynastic times say, King Menu lived in this date, we go, textbook, this is the date that they said. But when they say a little further that we don't like, oh, well, that's just the mythical.
You're going against the conditioning. And Dolly says, E.T. taught me about 8 other civilizations before Atlantis. I think there were many civilizations before Atlantis, for sure. I think Atlantis is just the one that people gravitate to because it just disappeared.
And it's the most analogous to, I would say, the modern West in many ways. In fact, Edgar Casey said that, and so did Frederick Oliver. He said, look, many of those that were around in the final destruction are back again, including Adolf Hitler, including Stalin, including many totalitarian leaders in the 20th century, were reincarnations of the final battles of Atlantis for power before the cataclysm. In their version of the Kali Yuga cycle. And so many people that came to Casey were like, you know, in the 1930s, in this advancing time of, you know, airplanes and, you know, television coming out in the 50s and
that
radio.
was a bit wiggy in that time period too for him. That was brave of him to be so forthcoming, because that would have been a little bit a faux pas, you know, family secret. Right?
Sure. And I mean, you know, he even predicted many of the events of World War II. In fact, he including, which to me as a military historian as well was fascinating, in one reading during World War II, when the Germans were, you know, very close to winning the war against the Soviet Union, somebody asked him, like, will we be able to stop the Aryan menace, as they called it? And he said, on this day and, you know, this week, the fate of the world depends on this battle. And you look at that date and you go, okay, well, what was going on there? Well, that's the Battle of Kursk. That's when the Nazis essentially threw everything they had at the Soviet Union and were catastrophically defeated. And then we're on the run for the next 2 years until they lost. And it's like, nobody knew that. Casey wasn't sitting in with Hitler in the high command.
That's right.
Listening to the Battle of Kursk. That was a secret plan that no one knew about in America on a couch.
Right.
Yet he knew that.
Right.
So, again, it's not just limited to past lives. And to answer, you know, what you were saying about previous civilizations, Frederick Oliver talks about that, the kid from the 19th century. And he says, you know, Atlantis itself was a kind of late stage of much older civilizations like Lemuria, and even things that preceded. And Casey alludes to that, like pre 300, 400,000 years. And he said, those even I can't even access, you know what I mean? Like they wouldn't even make sense to you. So we're going to stick with what you can handle, because that's where you were. You were this person in Atlantis. And again, you know, I wrote the book not even thinking about the parallels with today. But as I was publishing it, I started to look around the world in 2020, 2021, 22, 23. And I'm like, hold on a minute. Something's going on out there in Davos. And it reminds me a lot of some of the things that I saw in these final days of Atlantis. You know, this push for a totalizing control death grip on human civilization, this disparity between power and technology levels that are disclosed to the people and then to the elite, which Casey goes into a whole side story about. No one really knew how their civilization worked except for a small inner circle.
Right. It's no different now.
No scientists, right.
Right.
And, you know, that ultimately proved to be one of their, you know, kind of downfalls, was concentration of power. And in Frederick Oliver's account, which is extraordinary that he said this in 1881, he said at the final phases, like approaching 10,000 BC, he said the rulership could divest themselves of physicality and become as electricity. So it's like, were they uploaded to a cloud? Were they in a transhumanist, weirdo Ray Kurzweil universe? I don't know. It sounds like it. And he said, and what happened was everybody forgot how to. And in 1881, Michelle, he described a holographic projection from a smartphone.
Yes. Kind of like Enoch.
That he carried around. Right. And you realize why when Enoch went to the Crystal Palace, then they, you know, conveniently, they only let
Where was the Crystal Palace?
And they only let the Ethiopian church have that book. Yeah.
Right.
I couldn't read that one when I was in Catholic school, unfortunately.
No, exactly.
When Enoch went to the Crystal Palace. Yeah.
Yeah.
But,
maybe it was Atlantis.
Well, I mean, it's really interesting because even that question comes up of visitors. And you got to think how unbelievably advanced that question was in 1930. When a woman asked Edgar Casey, are we the only species on planet Earth? This is before a picture of planet Earth existed or the first UFOs were even reported in public.
Right.
Besides the airships and, like, you know, if you were on a military recovery team in Magenta, Italy, and you saw the first crashed craft that they recovered, then you knew. But the public was not aware whatsoever until after World War II that
Right.
there could be extraterrestrials. That was not in the public parlance, so to speak. And so this woman asks him that, and he says, well, it's interesting because before the final destruction, some of the group were warned, decades in advance. And they said, warned by who? And he said, well, the people from the outer spheres through the portal told them. And he says, you were one of the keepers of that portal. And she says, portal? And he says, yes, a way of communication with those of the outer worlds or outer spheres and you.
Right. See?
And then they also asked him, are any other planets in our solar system inhabited? And he said, no.
So
It's not just it's not just like a simple thing. Like he said, there are and have been extraterrestrial visitors that visited Atlantis, that warned them. They weren't the principal builders of everything, but they influenced them.
Mm-hmm.
Just like today, like aliens didn't build, the stealth bomber, but perhaps we engineered it based on recovery of materials. That's possible in the Skunk Works, Nevada test site.
Right.
And it's, I think, the same with Atlantis. They didn't literally just have aliens building the pyramids in Atlantis, but they could have advised or played a role.
Sure.
Communicated certain ideas.
Dolly says that Mars was inhabited. So was it at the time maybe that Casey? Was it a current or inhabited now? Right.
Exactly.
Because we see all kinds of stuff on Mars.
No, I believe absolutely Mars.
Stuff we're like, yeah, what is up with that?
I believe absolutely a million years ago, Mars absolutely was inhabited.
Right.
But she was saying at this time are any planets in 1932. He said no.
Right.
No, they're not.
Right.
Which is accurate. She didn't say what was Mars like in 2 million BC. He probably would have said, well,
it was just currently, right.
I
love how Edgar Casey did communicate about extraterrestrials. I mean, you can go back throughout our ancient past as we investigate in hieroglyphs, petroglyphs, different monuments. We know that extraterrestrials were very much present. I mean, they talk about it in the Old Testament. You can see it in old paintings. Like I said, Leonardo da Vinci, disappeared for 2 weeks, came back even more brilliant than he was. It's like
no, that's really true. That's really interesting, actually. I forgot about that.
Yes,
I forgot about that.
There's just so much. Why do you think people are just so fixated on Atlantis? I mean, you went into a lot of detail. I think it would answer a lot of questions, but what do you think the fixation is? Because they clearly, when I look at the information you have in there, I'm just like, wait till you get a load of that information, and then you'll be able to say, now I know I am fixated. It's just culturally speaking, it's like everybody was a part of it.
Well, exactly. And quite ironically, rather than being a mythical lost civilization, it was the default state of most of humanity.
Right.
We are in the aberration period where we're beginning like little children, like the Egyptians said, from nothing, and are clapping ourselves on the back because I can talk to you through a little crappy webcam.
I know. Isn't it great?
In reality...
How primitive.
Yeah, but in reality... we used to be living like Star Wars,
and we should still be living like Star Wars.
Should be, and
we're suppressed.
Right, and I think a time will come. According to Dev Mishra, it's quite interesting because he recognized that there was a mistake in the traditional dating of the end of the Kali Yuga, which is 1,000 plus, 6,000 year roughly time period of the nadir of human morality, consciousness, even physicality. Our bodies, our brains have shrunk since that time. That's been documented. So we're dumber than we ever were.
We're a species with amnesia.
A species with amnesia and a smaller brain. And so he realized, he did a correction on the Yuga chart, and he goes, do you know, Michelle, when the Kali, and it would explain everything you see if you go on Twitter, or definitely everything you see if you go on mainstream news. The official end of the Kali Yuga is around December 21st, 2025. And then begins a period called ekpyrosis, which is the opposite analog of catastrophos, which was the destruction by water. This is a 1200-year period of a destruction and burning away of evil through fire.
Well, shit.
And then the golden age.
Pardon my French. So
Yeah, I'm ready. Get ready.
wow. So
But it makes perfect sense because I watch world leaders lie and people die and they walk away with a smile and they're innocent and they get paid millions of dollars and nothing happens to them while people go to jail for smoking a joint. If anything could be the more the apotheosis of just the banality of evil and just ignorance and uncaring, it would be that kind of stuff.
you got to go to Canada. They'll let you smoke as many.
We are 1 year away from the final end of that stage of just complete bullshit that we've been born into and inherited since pre-biblical times.
Right.
So it's like, it actually, to answer your question, the reason we can't believe in something so, evident and scientifically obvious as we used to be way better,
right,
and we were destroyed through this natural cycle that happens every 25,000 years in history, is because we're too stupid. It's because we are the people that were born into the dumbest, most corrupt period of human history. And even the smartest person alive today is a kind of shadow fragment of a person on average 15,000 years ago in, say, the Silver Age of Atlantis, or say even before that in the Dwapara Yuga, in the Golden Age, when people could telepathically communicate with animals and manifest food and all this stuff.
Yes.
That's why. It's because the age we're in precludes the ability to be able to think the Golden Age until we can burn through for 1,200 years through the ekpyrosis, whatever the hell that's going to be, and maybe reincarnate in the following Golden Age in the year, say, 3,250, which I look forward to, having a big party on the beach in, the Golden Age.
May not even be on this planet, because you can incarnate anywhere you want to, right? Like,
right.
I want to go hang out at Mount Shasta and just slip right out.
No. I don't want to go in. I want to come
Sedona.
back. If I had to go through this shit in Kali Yuga, I'm coming back here to party in the Golden Age, in Miami Beach Golden Age, Atlantis risen Golden Age. That's what I'm interested in.
Right. But Atlantis, I mean, they did find traces of that in Sedona and the Grand Canyon. Come on, like, you talk.
Well, and that's actually very interesting. And I used that temple they found with actually Indian. A lot of people talk about Egyptian, but if you read that account, which again I cite the two people who, to their credit, they do have some legitimate critiques of that story, because it was written in a kind of unscientific journal that reported a lot of sensational things. It was written in a tabloid, the Arizona Gazette, that official story, and allegedly the person that was supposed to be the guy who found it was never listed in the Smithsonian journals. But you can't trust the Smithsonian, so I don't rule that out.
But they did all the giant bones and dumped them all in the ocean.
I was just going to say, I mean,
them existed, but we destroyed them.
It's like trusting, the CIA until you read the declassified documents. Like, just because the Smithsonian doesn't agree that J.A. Whatever his name was a official explorer, then it doesn't mean. But anyway, that story is, what's so weird about that story is that, I mean, the inside of that structure that the explorer Kincaid claims to have found while he was canoeing down the Snake River, then he went into this crazy, cave city with these tombs, and then he says, I saw an effigy of the Buddha holding a cactus with like good and evil, but it looked like Hindu.
Wow.
And I was like, that's interesting. He didn't say Egyptian. He said Hindu.
Wow.
I spent a year in the Edgar Cayce online archives looking for any reference of that area, Sedona, Arizona. And I must have spent like literally a year because, I mean, he had thousands of clients from Arizona, or he had like a medical place he was sending people in Arizona, until I finally found something and it said, you know, you used to live in the cities, in the caves that were built into the cliffs of Arizona.
See,
And you were a part of a group called the
portals.
Hapapulpik people, which is very close to the actual tribal name of the, I think it's like Havasuchik Indians or something like that. I
Right,
forget, but it's
right.
very similar. Hapapulpik was what Casey said the original group was. And the lady said, oh, like, where did we come from? He said, from the Indian lands. And he said, not these Indian lands, from the Indian lands far away. And it's like, wow.
The other side of the world.
Very weird. And, you know, the Hopi themselves have stories of, we come from Tibet. And it's like, what? What?
It's like, what did you say? Yes.
You came
No,
from Tibet.
That's
So,
crazy.
again,
That's
I think
crazy.
the bigger
I love
picture
it.
I learned was, regardless, you know, Atlantis was just like the kind of focal point to keep me kind of focused on, let me talk as much about this thing as I can, but let's also see what was going on the periphery, you know, at these different times. And so it kind of led me to touch on, like, was there an analogous culture in India in ancient history, you know, looking at Indian records and what they, and it appears that yes, there was. And in course, in one channeled reading, they were at war with each other at one point. You know,
Right.
this alternative to Atlantis that didn't use technology, but had mastered mental faculties. And in
Right.
one case, the Atlanteans tried to attack them with conventional weapons fired from flying machines, and this Indian group could just simply turn them away.
Do you think the Atlanteans were, you know, a little bit like what our elite are today?
Well, the one faction of
Police?
the Atlanteans were almost identical analogs to the Nazis. And Casey talked about them before the rise of the Nazis,
Right.
which is really interesting. And they were called the sons of Belial. And that's interesting because Belial, of course, is, you know, a character in the Bible. And, you know, that word Belial means wicked in Hebrew. And the sons of Belial can sometimes look, you could look at it as the acolytes of Belial, or just wicked, evil, materialistic people. There's in different interpretations. But Bel in Chaldean is a derivation of Baal, Baal Hamon from Phoenician, and Baal is a, you
Right.
know,
Bit of a bugger.
evil son of a bitch from the Bible.
Yeah, he's a bit of a bugger. Yes, he was. Yes.
In Casey's story, you know, he was around in Atlantis. And in
Right.
fact, the sons of Belial were these Nazi eugenicist psychopaths that sexually, you know, created mutant sex slaves and had like Epstein Island on steroids with mutants. And it's crazy. It's a crazy part of the book.
It's hard to think when you go that far back in history that sort of thing even existed. But I have to think, though, it's like any culture. You know, you have your good people, you have your bad people. I think you have people in control. You know, the technology are going to be the ones that, you know, they sort of, it's human nature. I don't think it matters how far back you go. Even when you're looking at people who are sacrificing other people who are in charge, you know, like.
Right.
So.
Right. And, you know, but, you know, it's interesting because it's not just a kind of easy story to piece together, because I always tell people, think about how much our history has changed since 1776.
Right. Yes.
You know, and of the, let's say, 6,000 to 7,000 years of recorded history, think about how much has changed in the last 250.
Yes.
And that's 7,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're talking about a culture that, let's just take Edgar Casey's example of, it started around 100,000, had a first destruction at 50,000, a second at 28,000, a third at 10,000. Who really knows what the interim millennia were like? They could have been so different from each other, that with minor cataclysms and uprisings and destruction, it's anybody's guess. He just kind of focused on these very specific times near the destructions, because his clients apparently had lived in those times and were traumatized by decisions they made. Like one woman joined with the factions of Belial at the end, and he says that she goes, well, what? She was like, it says her name like Catholic, 20 years old,
Wow.
Cool girl, and then the name is redacted because it's a real reading from the a private citizen in 1932, and she says, well, who was I? And he takes her back to revolutionary times, then Rome, then you saw Jesus, but you weren't really close to him, but you lived around there. And then the thing that really is affecting you now is because at the final destruction, you decided to join with the sons of Belial. You were involved in what he called debaucherous sex parties.
Karma. He was hitting with a dose of karma. Oh boy.
And then you decided to start putting people through a sacrificial flame and then spreading their ashes within the circular city's canals and making prisoners of war drink the water mixed with the ashes.
Wow. That's harsh.
And you thought that was fun.
That's got some major karmic juju.
So that's why things are not going so great today.
Wow.
But he said you always have a choice and you can always make it up. And
the law of one.
Experience.
I've spoken about the law of one for like ever, and it's just interesting to see it show up in the book.
Well, and it's true because he was one of the first people to ever talk about that, and he said that those two factions, the sons of Belial, were this kind of like technocratic Nazi WEF Davos weirdos, and then on the other side you had the children of the law of one, who were they weren't perfect, but they were more like a Jedi council that was really just trying to preserve the culture and not really push it. That's true in the convoluted universe. In fact, I hadn't even read the convoluted universe, Alison Carr, when I wrote the book.
Yeah.
And when I read all of them after, I was like, I have to put another edition out, because so many of her clients in the 90s and 2000s and 80s from that book had stories that were unbelievably similar to Edgar Cayce's stories. And they, to my knowledge, had never read that.
I see an update. I see an update coming. Yes.
Yeah.
But I also like that you went back and you spoke about the Gnostics and the Essenes and the Archons.
Oh, yes.
The Archons.
Oh, yes.
Right. Oh, we have to touch on that, because people don't understand. Like I've studied Gnosticism, and I've always found it intriguing that these people had such an understanding of the stars, and they knew, that then the Archons are still around, in one shape or another, form or another today. Right. And then because it goes back to,
we left.
Right. There we go. Take it away. Oh, don't tell me you're frozen. Somebody doesn't want him talking about Archons. Try and come back in. Oh, are you there? Okay. You froze completely. Okay.
The Archons.
I was going to say, I just finished saying somebody does not want Michael talking about the Archons. Okay.
They don't like it when you talk about them.
They don't. So just go for it. This is the outer realm, after all.
Well, it's really interesting, because before I was ever interested in Atlantis, actually, I think it was my first year as a professor. I was 23 years old, and I taught at a Catholic university, and I had just kind of come out of graduate school where I studied really Enlightenment critiques of organized religion was my specialty. And so I wasn't very happy to listen to the people at the university tell me about God and this and that. I was actually quite insulted. And so I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to teach the children about Gnostic Christianity in my religion class and see how long before they fire me or I get an email, which I never did. They never caught me. And I really spent a long time on that, because it was so interesting to me as a person who, have been raised in the Catholic Church, but, not in a dogmatic way. But I had
Right.
looked at those stories and just thought, oh, this is interesting. And okay,
Yes.
like that,
Same.
it could be, I don't know. Like,
I
I don't
find it
really think about,
interesting, but
I
it
didn't
was
think
there.
about it.
Yeah.
I like the stories of when they blow up the
Yeah.
Temple of Baal and all this. It's pretty
Right.
cool.
Yes.
But when I read the Gnostic stuff, I started to think, this actually makes
Com-
sense of how you
That's how I felt.
explain this kind of
Yes. Frozen.
hidden.
Come
Let me
back.
try another network here.
Oh, here you
Oh,
are.
they're really
Yeah.
and
You're,
Archon jamming
I
right
was
now.
gonna say.
Yeah,
Yes.
it is weird. I mean,
You were fine up till
I
then.
don't know. Yeah, it
But
was
the
perfectly fine.
Gnosticism
Well,
made sense
the thing
to me
was,
too.
I guess, yeah, the thing was, it just intuitively made sense. And one of the readings that I used to teach the kids that really hit home was this text called the Hypostasis of the Archons.
Mm.
And you could translate that as the instantiation or the reality of the rulers, because that's what archon in Greek means, is the ruler.
Right.
And who these things were and what their role was. And it's interesting because the Gnostics, who wrote this, and this was probably written in like 200 AD or something, we don't really know, but it was dug up. I think that one's from the Nag Hammadi library.
Yes.
And what they say is interesting, because you could apply it to today. And they say, well, really, this Yahweh character that you all think is God is what they call an aborted fetus, is how they describe him, and a demiurge. And that the true God, which is not anthropomorphic, but is a female generative creative source called faith, wisdom, or Pistis Sophia, which is like a galactic center kind of thing. She's really the one. And this bastard came down and fooled everybody and has you worshiping him for the next, thousands of years, while his archons roam about and jam your internet and make people do wacky things.
It's crazy.
And that actually made sense.
I've been asked by people, and guys, just don't take this literal. The show is about bouncing ideas around, so we're going to mind bend a little bit again. But I've actually had people hypothesize as to prayer, like, is it opposite?
Yes, I've seen that as well.
See?
No, I've heard many people say that, because,
Yeah.
and not even religious people, just the
people,
concept of admitting weakness itself is almost like contrary to the original message of, I would argue, Christianity, which is empowerment, and that you are God and that the power is within you. You don't need a supreme authority to beg for help, and that's actually keeping you in an infantilized, archonic type of energy.
Right. Right.
And that the whole thing is just really like, the whole thing is just kind of like a grand kind of disempowerment effort that the Gnostics realized was taking place, as they were being persecuted by Rome, who ironically adopts Christianity for the Roman Empire, and then it becomes the Catholic Church, and then it becomes the imperial war cry for the Crusades. And it's like, where do we go from love thy neighbor to the Crusades? Well, through the archontic path.
Because ancient cultures actually did follow the feminine energy for a lot of years. All the temples were pretty much, to feminine energies. The whole like goddess, who I am woman, here more, it's just that sort of, there was that sort of mentality. Goddess statues were showing up everywhere. That are going back 60,000 plus years, 30,000 years ago.
Yeah, even in original, I guess you call it Canaanite religions, from which Yahweh himself was, or El at the time, was a deity. You had Asherah, who was a goddess with the bird body, half woman, half bird, and why is she not around today? Well, because a king ordered her statues to be rooted from the earth,
Right.
and punishable by death if you worship her or anybody else.
Right.
So,
Right.
and it's interesting too, because a
It's
lot
all
of the
Old
characters,
Testament stuff. I mean,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, I look at the Old Testament, after reading particularly the work of Vatican translator Mauro Biglino, who would know better than anybody, from translating in ancient Hebrew to Italian for 35 years,
Right.
that really the Old Testament, upon close read, is the story of extraterrestrial colonization of this region of Earth,
Right.
and a war between the Elohim. And as Mauro always says, I mean, the title of his Italian book is "The Bible Does Not Speak of God." And it's true. That's an English word that was crowbarred onto it after hundreds of years of
gods had
theological
names.
debate.
Yeah.
Right. And they were corporeal. They were very powerful. I mean, that's what Elohim means, the powerful ones. And Mauro does a very good job of showing that it's not just his opinion. Even words like the Holy Spirit, or ruach, does not mean Holy Spirit. It actually means, heavy object, or kavod means heavy object of war. And so when Moses goes to the top of the mountain to see Yahweh's kavod, and he has to hide behind a rock so the fire doesn't burn him, it's like, what are we talking about here?
Right.
Are we really talking about the glory? That's how that word is translated, as Moses needed to see the glory of God. But if you just put the words in like Mauro does, he says he wanted to see the kavod of the Elohim.
Right. Right.
So it's like, that's what it actually says.
A lot of misinterpretation.
We put this other thing because we didn't have a reference point in the Renaissance when these things were being translated, because we didn't have flying machines. So we didn't know, like, what kavod, okay, it must be like a spirit or something like this, because only in the 21st century do we go, wait a minute, that sounds a lot like, a UAP or some sort of government craft or some sort of thing that we could imagine even through science fiction, that these people had no idea what they were reading. When Ezekiel goes up in a whirlwind, they're like, oh, that's just like a thing. And it's like, yeah, but really read that. Because that whirlwind has a specific, wheel that comes out of it. And then it's a person in a dome that looks
sort of like Ezekiel's wheels. Yeah. Right.
I think absolutely that these Elohim, these powerful ones were a big part of that, and that the Gnostics were talking about that we were deceived by extraterrestrials. Or I'm not even saying extraterrestrial. I mean, the only evidence I have of that is allegedly in one translation, and I take all of them with a grain of salt, because I think there's only like 5 people that can translate Sumerian cuneiform correctly.
Right.
But allegedly in one translation from an author I read who had the credentials to do it, he claimed that the origination point for the Anunnaki, or Anuna, was what they called beyond time. That's how he translated it.
Well, time is a man-made concept.
Right. That they came from, not from Earth, and beyond time, and they had a star system on the cuneiform tablet. Wow. So maybe, and were these the same people in the Bible? I don't know, because it's a time discrepancy. Or it's very likely that during the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BC, when the Bible was largely written, the Old Testament, they were just copying the Sumerian stories, and we think, oh, well, that happened to them in this time. And it's like, well, maybe they were just repeating for their group the stories they were told by the Sumerians. Because before that, they didn't believe in spirits. In fact, if you look, as Mauro says, they didn't even have the concept of monotheism. It didn't exist until Platonism, and then they had to crowbar Plato on top of this and say, oh, well, Yahweh was actually the Platonic creator God, and Jesus. And it's like, you're taking a lot of leaps of faith, pun intended, to take something from Greek history and say it applies retroactively to the Old Testament and call it theology, and say, well, that's what Jesus was talking about. And
it's a big guess if you weren't there. Right.
It's
Let me
all
get
a
Edgar
big yeah.
Casey. It's like, no,
Yeah, he has a lot to say about that actually. But
no, see.
I think it's just if it's if it's impossible for people to look at even the most, foundational aspects of society like the Abrahamic faiths and question them. Like, could
Mm,
Yahweh have been an extraterrestrial? That's not a silly question. That's
right,
literally what the Bible says he was and how he behaved as an
right,
extraterrestrial invader who flew around in a kavod.
right,
That's what they say. I didn't write it. We just
right.
never knew
Look it
that
up. Yeah.
because they'll never tell you that because
No.
it's been translated 1,000 times, 1,000 versions, and you have to go to the interlinear version to learn that from a Vatican translator who himself, I think, was fired because they didn't like what he said.
Right.
But if you think that the Vatican doesn't know that, you're
The
crazy.
Vatican knows everything. They have
You're crazy.
exactly. They have all of these archives from the Library of Alexandria, which had important, writings from cultures from all over the world used to go there to study and share
And
information.
what's really weird is I had seen a few of the Edgar Casey readings used in this book in other books throughout the decades.
Mm,
Like any book on Edgar Casey and Atlantis, it's basically going to use maybe half of the 500 readings.
right.
But I found an Edgar Casey reading, the only one on the Library of Alexandria, which was very interesting. And he said to a client, "You were one of the original founders of this library." But he says, it wasn't built when you think it was built. It was built when Atlanteans left before the final destruction. And it's actually was the oldest repository of knowledge in the world. And that part was
Yes.
in italics and bold.
Well, see.
So
And
we
we know where
think,
that's
oh, this is
sitting.
just,
Yeah.
yeah. And we think it's like, okay, like it was just the oldest library, for us today, and it had the Mediterranean worlds. But Casey, that was a 10,000-year-old library collection by the time of its first destruction
Interesting.
accidentally by
Yes.
Julius Caesar when he was getting down with teenage Cleopatra,
Right.
protecting
Right.
her from her crazy
Right.
brother. And he
Right.
set the city on fire and it accidentally caught on fire. But the
Library.
real destruction, where it went to the Vatican, I'm almost certain, was when Orthodox Christians under Theodosius ordered the destruction. And
That's
they
right.
specifically dismantled it systematically, raided it, pillaged it. I'm sure carted all that shit to the Vatican
Yeah,
and
they
then
have it all.
burned
Absolutely.
it to the ground.
Absolutely. They have it all.
Right.
Just the fact that you know, it's known, even scholars have said no, information from all over the world. So
Mm.
with that being said, to me, very much indicates the fact that there were people were coming, even maybe possibly from the Americas, going back and forth. I mean,
Oh,
there's
absolutely.
so of course all this is sitting in the archives without a doubt. How many other, like in Romania, for example, in Egypt was the same, where they
Mm.
found, libraries intact. Romania underground library intact.
Wow. Wow, I
What's
hadn't heard of
there?
that.
Oh,
I did hear
yes,
recently
yes, yes, yes.
of a
Yeah,
Tibetan library that's supposed to be
also,
one of the oldest in Tibet. And
yes.
nobody's translated like 99% of the books in there from ancient Tibetan to English. So it's like what's in those books? I always tell
That's
people too, Carthage before the Roman.
oh no, come back. We're so close. I think we've got some quiet. Michael, you're frozen. You're frozen. I can't hear you. You're frozen. I know. There, you're back. Okay. He froze.
I'm sorry.
No,
I'm
that's
sorry.
okay. Everybody's
Well, I
going,
tell people
no.
too. It's not just the Library of Alexandria. Like Carthage had one of the largest ancient libraries in the world too. and the Romans burnt that to the ground along with the entire city. And I don't think they preserved those records from my information. And that would have had all the records of the Carthaginians traveling to Brazil or to Lake Superior in Michigan to copper mine, perhaps, or, you know, all over the place where you find Phoenician artifacts and things like this. So it's like, who knows? You know, like they didn't keep permanent records in the way that, you know, anticipating, oh, well, we got to keep these because in 20,000 or 10,000 years, you know, somebody's going to need them. It's just like, look, we're at war, and do I want to save Cleopatra, or do I give a shit if some old library that I've never heard of burns down? Like, you know, just like when the Allies.
Oh boy, right. Hang on. Frozen.
Hello.
Okay. Yeah, you're freezing up like crazy. Somebody's out to get you. Divulging too much. You're frozen. Hello. We're coming up to, okay, we're coming up to the top of the hours. So before we lose you completely, why don't you tell us where can people find the book? How can people contact you? Do you have anything else coming up? Did you hear anything I said? Okay.
I got the last part. Where can people contact you? Thank you.
Thank you. We're coming up to the top.
We got through most of it.
We got through most of it. We can do a part 2.
I would love to.
Okay.
I would love to. And I would love to do a part 2 on maybe like specific questions from your readers, you know, and I don't like just lecture. I like to learn from the audience.
Oh, it's very, very round table here. We love to give, you know, the guests as much time to speak as possible, because the time goes by so quick. And sometimes there's so much information, you just want to get it out. So we're always happy to listen, and you could watch the interaction. And, you know, if there's questions, we definitely can put them up for you. You get a lot of comments and things like that, which is great.
Oh, great.
And of course, our audio listeners, we're an FM station. So our audio, we have a huge audio international audience as well. So yes.
No, thank you so much. It's a real honor, you know, to get the message out. And, you know, I would just tell people, if you're interested, you know, for those of you looking, you know, there it is in a better, there's a hardcover. You got the hardcover. I got the soft cover here. You know, I made that cover myself on my phone, and it was a complete accident.
I love it.
Contrast, like, all the way accidentally.
Right.
And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. That's
I
like
did
the
good.
comet. That's like the comet. I'm leaving it. I swear to God, that's a true story. I was like, that was just a serendipitous thing, and I could never reproduce it. I've tried many times. I lost the original file.
This is what it was supposed to be.
It's true. It's really weird.
Yes.
But yeah, if people want to, you know, contact me for anything, any questions, you can go to Michael Flem, with my last name as one word.com, and I have a contact form. And if you're interested in the book, it's available on Amazon. It's called Visions of Atlantis, Reclaiming Our Lost Ancient Legacy. Or if your grandma gave you a Barnes & Noble gift card, you could use that as well at Barnes & Noble. And yeah, it's available actually in audiobook, Kindle, and hard and soft cover, and also all those formats in Spanish as well, if you prefer that.
Wow. That's
and
excellent.
Spanish audiobook with a really great narrator. It's like straight from Telemundo. I don't know where I found this guy.
I love it. I love it. I love it. I would definitely be pleased if you would return, and because there's just so much more, you know, to the book, and we could definitely
That's just
go
the
over.
Intro. That's just a little intro.
Exactly.
The appetizer. We haven't gotten really into the main course.
The
which
meat
is
on
really
the bone.
weird.
We haven't done it yet.
The mutants, the genetic engineering, all of that, the destruction, the 2-oi crystal, how it works, how it functions.
See,
That's quite weird. That's quite weird.
it,
So yeah.
see, so much, so much. Well, we will do it. I'll throw some dates at you, and
Mm,
we'll definitely do it again because it's one of those things that it does leave you hanging. That's how I felt when I was reading the book. Just sitting there.
good.
I think I did like
Good.
200 pages just in the first round.
You're not the first person to say that, and that means so much to me because I think I must have spent a year editing the
Right.
book when it was pretty much done because it's so difficult to keep these things interesting without just boring people with look at this ice core sample and this and
That's true. It's
Plato and
hard.
this is the dimensions of the king's chamber, and it's like I really wanted it to stand out and be like a thrilling, like a Michael Crichton novel but based in reality. And so thank you so much because that was what I was trying to achieve without compromising my integrity as a scholar.
Right. No, you did. You definitely succeeded, and it was just a joy to read it. And I would love to talk about it more, and we can even include some photos from the book, a few as we go along,
Sure.
and make it really interactive if you'd like.
I would
So,
love that.
yes,
Yeah, there's some things that you really have to see to believe, you know?
yeah. Well,
I
we
think
can
people
go over
really
that.
would like that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, I love it.
Absolutely.
We'll do it then. I will message you, and we will pick another date.
Now
I
call
think
my agent. Call my agent. I don't take calls myself anymore. You could call
your
Beverly
people could
Hills. And,
talk to my people. Right,
yeah,
okay.
um,
I
I
like
don't.
that.
I don't do those things anymore. No, of course I
Right.
do. I'm a self-published author who does all of my promotion. So yes, of course, I would love to.
I love it. I love it. Okay, well, I will be in touch, and I will have links for you and so on. I'll send you some, like, the audio links as well, because watch that take off. So with
Oh
listeners. Yeah, that'll be
no,
good.
I'm so excited because, as I said, I love reading other people who are open-minded. I love reading their books, and I'm
Right.
still always learning. I never admit that I'm the last and final resource on this subject. I'm the last in a long line of much more intelligent, much more accomplished Atlantis scholars that I'm very lucky to have read and encountered. But I
Right.
wanted to just both bring those people that were forgotten to an audience and
Mhm.
take the cutting edge discoveries of the last 2 and 3, even 5 years. So much has come out and show
Right.
people, look, this is the time to really pay attention because I think it's becoming almost undeniable that at least we could say there probably was something, whatever you want to call it, and it probably did get destroyed. And these ancient stories are probably talking about a lived reality. And we should take that seriously because it could happen again.
History does have a way of repeating itself.
That's all it does, according to the
Exactly.
Yugas. Yeah.
Exactly.
So
Oh,
there you go.
it sounds like a scary thing. We'll have to touch on that a little bit more. That's really
Well, you
interesting.
just come back. You never die. You just keep coming back. But
I
it
know,
sucks
just
when you're
recycle.
in the destructive period. It's quite
Yeah.
horrible. And, you're faced with kind of extreme choices. You
Right.
could live an extremely good life. You can live an extremely hedonistic life today. And, if you're a
Right.
politician, get away with it.
Right.
You tell the truth, and people could think you're crazy and you could be ostracized.
Sure.
But you've
Yeah.
got a lot of choices. But, as Edgar Casey said, it's not like you're punished. It's just you're just playing a game against yourself. Like there's
That's
no
true.
real right or wrong. It's not like Baal was qualitatively worse than Jesus, as hard as that is to sound. It's just what do you
Ooh.
prefer?
Ooh. Well, yeah, that's a tough one because, it comes
What
down
do
to
you prefer?
conditioning, right? You
Yeah.
have no control over what goes on. You just have control over how you deal with it.
Yeah, that's right. And in Edgar
Right.
Casey's estimation and in mine, I mean, I don't mean to insult Christians. I have tremendous respect. I think most people think I'm a devout Christian because I'm always talking about
Yes.
Jesus and you should pay attention to what he's saying, what he really said, not what you think he said.
Right.
But I think that's really true that even Edgar Casey would say, like, he just represented the paragonal example of goodness
Right.
expressed in one person. So did the Buddha. So
Right.
did all these people that came,
Right.
among ancients to teach them,
Hmm.
but that you really needed the foil of a Baal and a Beelzebub and these Sith characters, because they were the
The
perfection of
balance.
the and they were just acting the best they could with the knowledge they had in a perfection of evil. And you
Hmm.
have to respect that. You might not necessarily like it,
Hmm.
but it's almost silly to say like, well, I want all evil to go away, because then it's like, well,
You
probably
could
won't.
want it, you can hope for it, but the chances of that happening are very unrealistic,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
And I think a lot of people want it to go away because they're secretly tempted. And that's another side story in the Atlantean saga, is how so many of these people, like that nice priestess, she started off in the temple. Before you
Right.
know it, she's putting
Fell
people in
fell
that
to the
ash
dark side.
water and drink your
Went
own ashes.
went for the cookies. We're on the dark
Yeah.
side. Yeah. Oh my
That's the
gosh.
Atlantis, easy bake
Right.
oven. It's like,
Right.
but that's what I think really was the kind of final lesson and final message of the book to the audience, is that maybe you're so afraid of evil because perhaps you see it in yourself, and that acknowledging that it's neither good nor bad, it's just a kind of antimony or something like that, as Kant
You
would
would
say,
have to
that
understand your shadow self, which is definitely a thing.
right, and that the choice really in the end is,
Mm.
you always have that choice, it's like they
Yes.
did in Atlantis, just like we do now. Do we want to start World War III? Do we not?
Mm.
We'll see.
It's a tough one. It's a tough one. Well, Michael Laflemme, thank you. This was just a fantastic episode. Honestly, I was so anxious to speak with you after reading the book, because
Hmm.
it was really a phenomenal book. And anybody who's going to order it, remember, go and give Michael a review. Reviews are very important. So good
Yes, thank
reviews,
you so much.
especially do a good review. So
Oh, I like all reviews, even if you like it, don't like it. It helps me, really. I
it
always love it.
does.
The first review of the audiobook, somebody said, I included one special effect at the beginning of water, and this guy goes, I can't listen to an audiobook with. I immediately called my producer, please turn the volume on the water down. That was a 1-star review, and now
Oh,
it's fixed, and everybody loves the
and
audiobook now. So I
everybody's
always tell
happy.
people, yeah,
Wow.
I don't care about a number on Amazon. I really just care
Right. Want people to
that,
be happy and enjoy the read or the listen.
did you have fun, and did you learn one thing you didn't know? If you can do that every day, then you're a better person, I think.
Thank you. I say it all the time. Learn something new every single day, no matter how small. Learn something new. Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Well,
That's all you
well,
can do.
thank you. Thank you for joining me tonight. I will be in touch with you, and we will schedule a part 2.
Oh, thank you so much, Michelle. It was a pleasure. And thank you so much for the audience questions. And I'll see you next time if
You
we make
will.
it.
You will,
All
absolutely.
right.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Good night. Good night,
Take care.
Michael. You too. Well, that was a really, really interesting segment. Lots of comments from out the different chat rooms. And again, could put them all up. It's hard when I can't read them for our audio listeners. But we'll just have to do a part 2, because there's just so much more information coming out. So thank you, Michael Laflemme, for joining us this evening. Thank you to Folgers Coffee for sponsoring the show. Thank you to Justin Snicker and Steve McGinnis for sponsoring. We appreciate you so very much. If you guys want to get a hold of us, please, the Outer Realm Contact at gmail.com. Again, the Outer Realm Contact. I'm going to put this up and just save myself some work. There we go. The Outer Realm Contact at gmail.com. So give us your insight. We appreciate your comments. Like, share, and subscribe. Comment. Thank you, Tamara. Absolutely. Tomorrow night, for the first time, we will be bringing on Augie Nost, who is the co-host of the broadcast Team Alpha show/podcast. And he's an interesting guy. I co-hosted on the Church of Mavis one evening and had a lot of fun with him. And he's definitely has a lot he wants to talk about. So when he approached us, I thought, yes, let's do this. It's going to be a lot of fun. And he's just really, really nice guy. So he's going to be touching on his UFO sightings and experiences as a pilot, his thoughts on Project Bluebeam, and should time allow, he wants to talk a little bit about time travel and time slips and things of that nature. So hopefully time will allow. But until then, enjoy the remainder of your evening. Have a great Thursday day, and we shall see you back here tomorrow night. Thank you and good night.